Doctors cautioned that soft, sticky, or overly sweet foods could lead to tooth decay. Instead, they recommended crunchy foods like apples, grains, and legumes, which helped clean the teeth by scraping off residue. People also chewed mastic gum, a resin from the mastic tree, to freshen breath and cleanse the mouth, a habit still common in the Mediterranean. When dental issues arose, Greek physicians used treatments that included herbal remedies, spices, and basic surgical methods. Teeth were extracted with metal forceps, often without pain relief. Though the procedure was excruciating, herbal sedatives like opium poppy, mandrake, or henbane were sometimes used to ease the pain. Abscesses were treated by lancing them to drain the infection, followed by rinsing with salt water or wine to disinfect. Aristotle took a special interest in studying teeth, even mistakenly claiming that men and women had different numbers of molars, an error that nevertheless showed his attempt to organize human anatomy. The Greeks also recorded unusual dental conditions like delayed tooth eruption or people born without teeth. Dentistry wasn't a separate discipline, but part of general medical education. Doctors handled everything from ulcers to broken bones, and teeth were simply another area of the body to diagnose and treat. Ancient Greek dentistry combined science, keen observation, and high pain tolerance. Though it wasn't luxurious, it was rooted in the idea that the body, including the teeth, could be understood and improved through logic and study. Over millennia and across many civilizations, dentistry developed not as a straight path, but as a rich mosaic of innovation, rituals, and perseverance. From flint drills in ancient Pakistan to gold bridges in Etruria, from jade-inlaid Mayan teeth to Ayurvedic oil pulling, early societies tackled dental care with creativity, courage, and necessity. Their tools were basic and pain relief limited, but their advances were impressive. Even without germ theory or X-rays, they knew decaying teeth caused pain, and they acted. Whether by drilling cavities, using herbs to dull pain, or fashioning prosthetics for appearance, ancient healers, whether doctors, priests, or craftsmen, laid the groundwork for modern dentistry. What stands out even more is how diverse ancient dental practices were. They weren't just medical, they were spiritual, aesthetic, philosophical, and sometimes political. In some places, a smile with gemstones signified divine favor or high status. In others, dental deformities were linked to inner imbalance or seen as omens. Dental care clearly wasn't only about eating. The remnants they left behind, obsidian blades, copper instruments, gold wires, and herbal texts, are pieces of a global story. They show that ancient people, often dismissed as primitive, were in fact innovative thinkers. They observed, experimented, and passed down effective techniques. And many of those traditions still exist today. We continue to floss, rinse, and brush. We still use herbal ingredients like clove, mint, and myrrh. Some people still follow age-old practices like oil pulling or chewing neem sticks, not out of nostalgia, but because they're effective. While modern dentistry, with its implants, lasers, and 3D imaging, may seem far removed from ancient stone drills and mouse skull tools, the purpose hasn't changed: to ease pain, protect teeth, and enhance lives. Sleep in ancient Mesopotamia was never a passive act. It was a ceremony, a danger, and a discovery. To dream was to step into the realm of the gods, and one had to be ready, with prayers, sacred oils, and protective amulets. Among the ancient Celtic peoples, from Scotland's foggy highlands to the sacred oak forests of Gaul, dreams were viewed as gateways to the other world, a magical realm home to spirits, fairies, ancestors, and gods. Although their religious practices left fewer written traces than some other ancient civilizations, some were hanged, some imprisoned, and some got lucky. But that's another story. What was clear is that the courts weren't prepared for women who wielded swords, had strong opinions, and no patience for legal nonsense. Anne Bonny wasn't easily intimidated. She was an Irish redhead with a violent streak and little respect for men, including those who sentenced her to death. When she was captured in 1720, Jamaican authorities expected tears, pleas for mercy, and perhaps a heartfelt speech about religion or domesticity. Instead, she gave them sarcasm. Standing beside her fellow pirate Mary Read, Anne calmly listened to her death sentence, then stared the judge down and said, "If you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanging like a dog." A bit harsh, sure, but at least she stayed on theme. But Anne wasn't finished. She had one last pirate trick up her sleeve. She claimed to be pregnant. No one asked for proof. Under 18th century British law, pregnant women couldn't be executed, whether out of divine compassion or just reluctance to kill two people at once. So Anne didn't plead innocence. She pled her belly. And it worked. Her execution was postponed. Whether she was truly pregnant or just faking it with timely mango cravings is unknown. Some historians believe it, others see it as a clever act. Either way, she avoided the gallows. While her male crewmates swung in the breeze, Anne was sent to prison and then disappeared from official records. Rumors say her wealthy father arranged her release, that she started a new life, wore pants until the end, and kept insulting people as usual. What's certain is she didn't hang, and for a pirate, that's practically a peaceful retirement. Her case was more than just rare, it changed things. Pirate trials suddenly started looking like maternity wards. Female pirates began using pregnancy as a legal tactic. "I object, Your Honor, and also I'm pregnant." Anne Bonny didn't just outwit the system, she humiliated it. She made a courtroom admit that sometimes knowing your reproductive rights could save you from a pirate's noose. If Anne Bonny was fire, then Mary Read was steel, stoic, blunt, and built like she could beat Poseidon in an arm wrestling match. Mary spent much of her pirate life disguised as a man, fighting alongside them, which eventually landed her in court on piracy charges, sentenced to hang with Anne. Like Anne, Mary used the 18th century legal loophole of claiming pregnancy. She pleaded her belly, which might sound like a flimsy excuse, but was actually the oldest trick in the book to avoid execution. The court, bound by biology, delayed her hanging. But Mary's story took a grim turn. Unlike Anne, who disappeared into legend or quiet domestic life, Mary didn't get a second chance. Held in Jamaica's filthy and brutal prison conditions, she grew sick, likely from disease, pregnancy complications, and the general misery of the place. There's no record of her giving birth, only her quiet death in a cell. No escape, no final battle, no sharp-witted retort in court. Just illness and an unceremonious end for one of the fiercest women in piracy. History often leaves legends unfinished. Some say she died of jail fever, probably typhus, dysentery, or a colonial mix of both. Others think childbirth did her in. Either way, the result was the same: no hanging, but no freedom. Just another woman who died forgotten in a cell, while powdered wigs debated if she was ladylike enough to kill. Her ending was quieter than her life, perhaps the cruel irony of piracy, adventure at sea, silence on land. Mary Red didn't leave behind gold or a legacy of violence, only a somber reminder that even the toughest pirates could be defeated by something as mundane as illness and red tape. While Anne and Mary became Caribbean legends, on the other side of the world, a woman named Ching Shih was playing the piracy game on expert level and winning. She didn't lead a tiny ship with a few drunk sailors. She commanded a vast fleet. At her peak in the early 1800s, she controlled over 300 ships and between 20,000 and 80,000 pirates, depending on whether you trust historians or someone trying to impress a date. Ching Shih wasn't just a pirate queen, she was a seafaring empire. And unlike Bonny and Reed, she was never caught thanks to her cunning and foresight. When the Chinese Navy, Portuguese forces, and the British all tried and failed to bring her down, she made a bold move. She negotiated with them all. She walked into the governor's office in Guangdong, laid out her terms, and somehow convinced the Chinese government to pardon her, her entire crew, and let her keep the loot. She retired with her fortune, her dignity, and her life. Picture Captain Jack Sparrow striding into Parliament saying, "I'm done," and walking out with a pension and a business license. That's pretty much how it went. After retiring, she started a gambling house. Naturally, it's hard to go back to a quiet life after leading a pirate empire. Technically, Ching Shih was never captured, so her story doesn't follow the usual pirate tale, but it's important because she showed that a female pirate story didn't have to end in death or obscurity. Sometimes it ended with cleverness, survival, and a smug retirement. Governments didn't know how to handle women like her, not because she broke the rules, but because she made new ones. She wasn't swinging from rigging or making dramatic courtroom scenes. She was managing logistics, organizing supplies, and making moves that frightened warlords. Ching Shih didn't just avoid punishment, she negotiated her way out and walked away wealthier than most of the men chasing her. In most 18th century courts, being a pirate meant a guaranteed death sentence. But being a pregnant pirate changed things. That's where pleading the belly came in, a legal defense from English common law that sounds like an excuse to skip gym, but was actually a way to delay execution. The reasoning was simple. Killing a pregnant woman meant killing an innocent baby, which was unacceptable even to 1700s justice systems. So when a woman on trial claimed to be pregnant, she didn't need proof right away, just enough confidence to cause a delay. A group of women called a jury of matrons would be brought in to examine her and decide, often with little training and plenty of awkwardness, if she was telling the truth. Their methods weren't exactly scientific. A confident burp might save you, being too skinny might not. Some pirates were truly pregnant. Others faked it, stuffing clothes or relying on luck, and the matron's poor eyesight or kindness. If the plea worked, it bought time, months, even years, and time in prison could mean survival. Some used it to escape, others waited for public interest to die down for a pardon, or for a well-placed bribe to do its work. Judges often found it frustrating. They didn't like being outsmarted, especially by pregnant pirates who came in with boldness and legal tricks, but rules were rules. In many respects, Alexandria didn't just follow Heraclean, it replaced it, becoming the crown jewel of the Mediterranean and the new center of Egypt's maritime and intellectual life. However, the dynamic between the two cities wasn't merely one of rivalry. It reflected a broader shift in Egypt's political and cultural landscape. During Heraclean's height, Egypt was still under native rule. and the city's significance came from its roots in traditional Egyptian religion and its key position near the Nile Delta. It was the place where foreign vessels were checked, taxes collected, and royal authority affirmed through sacred rituals. But when the Ptolemies, the Greek rulers who followed Alexander, came to power, they redirected attention toward Greek traditions, city planning, and governance. They designed Alexandria to dazzle with its famous library, towering lighthouse, and expansive harbors, making it the new hub of control. Trade routes were redirected through Alexandria, effectively sidelining Heracleion. Even if a woman had once set a merchant ship on fire just for fun, the court had to wait if she was pregnant. It was a clash between piracy and legal loopholes where motherhood often came out ahead. While most male pirates were quickly executed, some female pirates managed to survive, not because they were innocent, but because they were either heavily pregnant or extremely convincing. Either way, it worked. Judges, embarrassed and flustered, would mutter, "She pleads the belly again." Once the legal spectacle ended and execution was postponed or skipped, authorities faced a new dilemma. What now? They couldn't just release a female pirate. She'd be back at sea before anyone noticed. But locking her up in a regular prison wasn't an option either. Those places were built for petty thieves, not women who hijacked ships and stabbed officers. So began the awkward process of finding places to keep them. These women ended up in improvised holding cells, old forts, abandoned houses, or, in desperate cases, chained in musty basements beneath government buildings. These weren't glamorous hideouts. Think less swashbuckling adventure, more nightmare rental. Sometimes they were locked up with other women, which sparked moral panic. What if the pirate inspired rebellion? What if other women caught the pirate disease and started dreaming big? In other cases, the pirate was held alone, under stricter watch than actual killers. Why? Because they were terrifying. Not just for their crimes, but because they had already shattered society's biggest unspoken rule. Being a woman who didn't care what men thought. Prison guards didn't know what to do. Was she a lady, a criminal, or a hurricane with a filthy mouth and a knife hidden who knows where? There were no rules for handling that. And if she was famous, it got worse. Crowds gathered. Newspapers ran sensational stories. Some guards even took bribes to let in curious onlookers. People literally paid to stare at the pirate woman, a true crime attraction before the term existed. But long-term imprisonment was always a risky move. The conditions were terrible, disease was widespread, medical care was basically, here's a bucket, good luck. Some pirates died quietly, while others lived on, growing older, angrier, and increasingly forgotten. Still, it was just barely better than execution. When authorities didn't know what to do with a captured female pirate, and prison wasn't an option, too full, too complicated, or just too inconvenient, they sometimes turned to the most puzzling solution of all: marriage. Yes, really. Instead of sentencing a woman who'd spent years looting ships to death or life behind bars, governments would occasionally decide that what she needed was a husband, because what better way to deliver justice than to marry off a convicted pirate to some unfortunate man who only came to town to buy sugar? The reasoning, if you can call it that, was that marriage would tame her. Surely, once tied to a dull husband and an even duller domestic life, her rebellious spirit would fade. A few years of washing clothes, raising children, and tense dinners, and voila, problem solved. Some female pirates went along with this, maybe just to survive. Others treated it like the perfect cover, swapping swords for soup spoons while dodging a noose. Of course, this plan sometimes backfired. Some women used marriage as a quiet rebellion. They hid weapons in the kitchen. They gave their children oddly sailor-like names. And let's face it, after commanding a ship and facing naval gunfire, it's hard to find curtain sewing thrilling. In some cases, women agreed to marry as part of a legal deal, testifying against their crew in exchange for freedom and a state-approved relationship. The courts, eager to brush everything under the carpet, often accepted. As long as she was off the ocean and tending a garden somewhere, the issue was considered resolved. Sometimes she even married another pirate, because nothing says love like shared criminal records. But this strange solution reveals something more. Authorities weren't after justice. They wanted control. And what better way to restrain a rebellious woman than by placing her under a man's authority? Some people still practice age-old methods like oil pulling or chewing neem sticks, not out of sentimentality, but because they're effective. Today's dentistry, with its implants, lasers, and 3D scans, may look completely different from ancient tools like stone drills and mouse skull picks. Yet the mission hasn't changed: to ease pain, protect teeth, and enhance lives. Even long before Instagram, female pirates knew how to shape their own stories. They made news, they sold newspapers, and sometimes they talked their way out of death. For every Anne Bonny or Ching Shih who ended up in songs, stories, and poorly researched costumes, there were countless others, possibly hundreds, whose names were lost, whose trials were never documented, and whose endings were quietly forgotten. History plays favorites. It remembers the bold, the loud, the impossible to ignore. But many women caught as pirates weren't icons, they were ordinary people. Sailors' wives who turned to piracy to survive. Barmaids who climbed aboard and discovered they were better with a blade than a beer tray. Some might have joined just for the thrill. Each of them broke through the barriers, a reminder that women weren't just passive figures in history. They fought, they bled, and sometimes they led. They might not have taken center stage, but they were there, just out of the spotlight, deliberately erased from the story, and that ironically made them the most pirate-like of all. So let's imagine the court didn't execute her, didn't sentence her to life, and didn't marry her off like some strange government-run dating program. Then what? Reform her, of course. Society couldn't just let an ex-pirate wander around freely. That would be dangerous. She might read, or worse, inspire other women to rebel. So the next best option, turn her into a respectable lady. 18th century rehabilitation was straightforward. Take this battle-hardened, sea-seasoned woman who once led men and cannon fire and teach her how to embroider. Because clearly, needlepoint is the perfect remedy for piracy. Some were sent to convents, others ended up in institutions for fallen women, a polite term for government-funded guilt prisons with awful meals. There they were encouraged or forced to repent, reform and reflect, preferably dressed in grey. Religion played a major role. The belief was, sure, she's looted dozens of ships and maybe even killed someone with a table leg, but if she learns the Lord's Prayer, she's basically redeemed. Sometimes it worked. Other times the pirates smiled through the sermons while secretly planning her escape. But this was never really about saving souls. It was about controlling the narrative. Governments didn't want these women in ports or taverns recounting the time they hijacked a Spanish galleon with guts and a dirty joke. They wanted them quiet, harmless, and ideally forgotten. Reform was a method of control to force female pirates back into the traditional, submissive role of womanhood. Bake bread, mend clothes, forget the mutiny you once led. But pirate fire doesn't go out so easily. Some reformed women slipped back to sea under new names. Others married and ran their homes like ships, disciplined, noisy, and maybe even armed. Some female pirates didn't need to fake pregnancies, marriages, or domestic skills to avoid execution. They just needed to talk. Snitching wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. Authorities didn't just want pirates caught, they wanted entire operations dismantled, names, routes, ships, loot. So when a captured woman started offering up that kind of information, people listened. And many of these women had real intel. They'd been on pirate crews, overheard plans while drinking, and knew which ports turned a blind eye on certain days. Under threat of hanging, their memories became suddenly sharp and extremely valuable. In return, they sometimes got pardons, lighter sentences, or at least a delay in execution and a better prison cell. But snitching wasn't without risk. Pirate codes, especially in the Caribbean, treated informers harshly. Still, with a noose in sight, loyalty could waver. Some women used it to stall, some got out entirely. A few even made it their job, helping navies hunt down their old crewmates. Picture a former mutineer pointing out hiding spots in court. It was brutal, but it worked. Of course, some of these women made things up. They named dead pirates, invented smuggling rings, or claimed ghostly encounters with Blackbeard. The authorities often didn't check and bought it anyway. It didn't always save them. Some still got hanged, but others walked free, disappearing into quiet towns with wild pasts. Turning informant was the pirate's ultimate pivot. Less sword, more strategy. Not all escaped the gallows. For every Anne Bonny or Ching Shih who found a way out, others still met their end, and when they did, it wasn't a silent exit. Public executions were the Netflix of the 18th century. Crowds poured in, peasants, nobles, street vendors, and kids with questionable supervision, all eager to witness the spectacle, the final scene of a pirate's life. Ideally featuring some dramatic last words, intense stares, and a poetic line about sin and the sea. But when a woman was the one being hanged, it took the fascination to another level. It was scandalous, it was taboo, and, unfortunately, it was great for ticket sales. Authorities used these moments as moral theatre, wrapping up their warnings in nooses. This is what happens when women step out of line, the state seemed to declare. This is the price of trousers, rum, and too much freedom. But the crowd didn't always go along with the script. Some female pirates won them over with wit or pure defiance. They had to hide their true identities just to be allowed on board. If found out, they weren't praised. They were often killed or worse. This was a world that didn't accept ambitious or violent women. Even among outlaws, sexism remained strong. Male pirates could be brutal killers and still be celebrated with nicknames, songs, and biographies. Female pirates, on the other hand, were either seen as temptresses, anomalies, or evil. There was no middle ground. When caught, their stories were shaped by the same narrow perspective. Authorities dismissed them as camp followers, pirate wives, or errors. Their actions weren't taken seriously, but their very presence was seen as offensive. So yes, there were probably more female pirates than we know of, but they didn't make the news. They didn't get trials or songs written about them. They became footnotes or were erased entirely. That erasure wasn't accidental, it was intentional. History likes its rebels to follow certain patterns, and a woman leading a pirate crew with a sword in hand didn't fit those patterns. The few who are remembered were too loud, too bold, or too visible to ignore. The rest disappeared into the anonymous ranks of sailors, lost under the assumption that piracy was a man's game. But the sea didn't care about gender, and neither did gunpowder. Only the record keepers did. So what happened to female pirates once they were captured? Some were executed, some died in jail, some got married, some claimed they were pregnant. A few talked their way out. One even secured a retirement deal that would make modern CEOs jealous. But most were simply forgotten. The real story isn't just about their fate. It's about what their faith says about the world they lived in. Writers took these women and molded them to fit their own stories. If a woman died young, she was portrayed as a tragic temptress. If she lived, she became a warning. If she beat the system, she was labeled a freak or a fraud. Subtlety wasn't part of the narrative. Over time, the real facts were buried under layers of dramatic storytelling. Anne Bonny was turned into a fiery redhead wielding a sword in one hand and rum in the other. Mary Read was reduced to her sidekick. Ching Shih became a stereotype of exotic danger, and many others were reduced to the same worn-out trope. She wore men's clothes as if pants were the real crime, and for those whose names never made the record, their stories became folklore. Nameless pirate queens in poems and pulp fiction, often sharing suspiciously familiar traits: seductive, vengeful, and always punished. Apparently, the only thing more dangerous than a woman with a sword was one who got a happy ending. But sometimes these tales had the opposite effect. Over time, readers stopped seeing female pirates as warnings and started seeing them as icons, rebellious, fierce, and powerful in all the best ways. The very stories meant to suppress them ended up inspiring people to wonder, why weren't there more women like them? That's their legacy. In life, these women were hunted, judged, and punished. In death, they were distorted, sensationalized, or forgotten, but in legend, they thrived, symbols of rebellion, complex and defiant reminders that women didn't just exist in history, they shook its foundations. After hearing about Bonny, Read, and Ching Shih, you might ask, why weren't there more female pirates? Were they really that rare, or were they just erased from memory? The short answer is sexism. The longer answer is deeply rooted sexism, cultural, legal, maritime, and logistical, mixed with fragile egos and bad hygiene. Ships were overwhelmingly male spaces. Many navies and pirate crews flat out banned women, claiming they brought bad luck or would distract everyone into crashing. Apparently, centuries of navigation training could be undone by a woman's hips. So the women who did manage to sail often had to hide their identity, wearing trousers, wrapping their chests, deepening their voices, a world that feared women with swords more than entire fleets. These were women who broke rules, crossed borders, challenged laws, and ignored fashion expectations. They set sail when they were told to stay on land. They fought when told to be gentle. They led when expected to obey. And when they were finally caught, society didn't just punish them for piracy, it punished them for stepping outside the roles they were assigned. Every reaction to their capture, whether execution, imprisonment, forced reform, or simply being erased from history, says more about how uncomfortable they made people feel than about the crimes they committed. It wasn't just that they were pirates, it was that they were women who didn't conform. Their stories, messy, scattered, and incomplete, still manage to challenge the neat version of history. They make us look past the stereotypes and see the real people, complex, smart, furious, capable, and often deeply exhausted. And yes, they broke the law. She made the court acknowledge that knowing your reproductive rights could sometimes be the difference between life and death in piracy. If Anne Bonny was like fire, then Mary Read was like steel, calm, direct, and tough enough to beat Poseidon in an arm wrestling match. Mary spent most of her pirating days disguised as a man and fighting just as fiercely, which is exactly how she ended up in court, facing piracy charges and sentenced to hang alongside Anne. Like Anne, Mary used the 18th century legal loophole of pregnancy. She also claimed to be pregnant, a defense that might sound like a flimsy excuse for a stomachache. Imagine if oatmeal decided to party. From the workers who built the pyramids to the pharaohs themselves, everyone drank beer. Tombs show that laborers were regularly given daily portions of bread, onions, and beer, a classic meal if you liked your carbs with a dash of hallucination. The idea was simple. Beer sustained life, helped build monuments, and probably made hauling 2.5-ton limestone blocks a bit more bearable. Even the gods enjoyed it. Hathor, goddess of music, joy, and tipsy dancing, was Egypt's original bartender. But it was Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war, who had a legendary drinking issue, one that might have saved humanity. According to myth, Sekhmet got carried away punishing humans and went on a rampage. To stop her, Ra dyed thousands of jugs of beer red and poured them out to look like blood. Sekhmet, thinking it was actual blood, drank it all. She passed out in a drunken sleep, and humanity was spared, thanks to a seriously epic beer run. Temples in Egypt didn't take beer lightly either. Many had their own breweries, and beer was often offered to gods or the dead. Showing up in the afterlife without beer was just bad planning. A few jars in your tomb, and you were ready to face eternity with a decent buzz. Interestingly, brewing beer was considered women's work. Most brewing happened at home, done by women, and some even held official titles like Mistress of the House of Beer. So yes, Egypt had beer women before it had pyramids. In the end, Egyptian beer wasn't just a drink. It symbolized fertility, life, and divine blessing. And, judging by Sekhmet's story, it might have been the original apocalypse prevention, one hangover at a time. While Sumer and Egypt worshipped beer, the ancient Greeks treated wine as their national pride. They saw beer the way we might see gas station sushi, sketchy and uncivilized. For them, true civilization began with fermented grapes and a proper toast. Wine wasn't just a beverage, it was fuel for intellectual conversations. And where did all that wine-fueled thinking go? A tipsy soldier was a loyal one, or at least less likely to rebel before lunch. But wine in Rome wasn't just about keeping troops happy or managing vineyards. Enter Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, ecstasy, and questionable choices. His worship included the Bacchanalia, wild secret gatherings full of drinking, dancing, and an alarming absence of togas. These festivals began as religious ceremonies but quickly turned into the ancient world's most exclusive parties. That is, until the Roman Senate shut them down in 186 BCE. Apparently, too many senators were waking up in fountains. Still, Rome's love of wine couldn't be stopped. They categorized wine much like modern sommeliers, by region, vintage, and how long it had aged in clay jars. The most prized was a strong, sweet wine from Campania called Falernian, basically the Dom Perignon of the era, minus the cork. And just like now, wine mirrored social class. The rich enjoyed fine wines, often mixed with honey, herbs, or even seawater for a salty kick. The poor got Laura a thin, sour drink made from reused grape skins, the ancient version of regret in a cup. But wine wasn't just for drinking, it was political. Emperors like Augustus used it to show restraint and virtue, while others, looking at you, Nero and Caligula, turned dinner parties into chaotic stage shows. If your emperor started mixing wine with crushed pearls or poisoning his guests, it was a sign things were going badly. Wine was everywhere in Rome, at celebrations, funerals, sacrifices, even baby showers if you squint. It fueled ambition, eased losses, and sometimes drowned the empire's conscience. In vino veritas, they said, in wine, truth, or at least a good excuse. While the Greeks and Romans were sipping wine from painted cups and quoting philosophy, the Celts were downing golden mead from horns bigger than toddlers. And honestly, they seemed to be having more fun. Mead, made from honey, water, and wild yeast, was the drink of choice for Celtic tribes across Gaul, the British Isles, and parts of Germany. Sweet, strong, and glowing like liquid sunlight, it was the drink of warriors and druids. Unlike the polished image of wine, mead was earthy, untamed, and tied to magic and nature. For the Celts, drinking wasn't just for fun, it was a full contact ritual. Their feasts took place in wooden halls, where warriors bragged about their exploits, recited poetry, and sometimes brawled over who sat where. 2. Welcome to the symposium, a rowdy, all-male drinking party that was equal parts frat house, TED Talk, and late-night therapy session. Imagine a bunch of philosophers in tunics, lounging on couches, sipping watered-down wine from ceramic cups, debating love, the universe, and sometimes petty theft, like who stole whose goat. And yes, watered down. Drinking wine undiluted was seen as uncivilized, the kind of thing a warlord from Thrace might do, or someone with no sense of social boundaries. The ideal ratio? 1 part wine to 3 parts water, just enough to keep you thoughtful and slightly dramatic. Running the whole show was the symposiarch, the ancient version of a party planner and wine enforcer. He set the rules, how strong the wine was, how fast it was drunk, and sometimes even the night's discussion topic. Think Socrates meets a modern DJ, minus the lasers but heavy on the life lessons. Wine wasn't just for parties either. It was medicine, ritual, and symbol. Doctors like Hippocrates prescribed it for everything from stomach problems to sadness. Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and ecstasy, represented both the joy and danger of drinking. His worship involved singing, dancing, trances, or sometimes complete blackout. As with everything in ancient Greece, wine had social rules. The rich enjoyed fine aged wine from imported jars, served by attentive servants. The poor got the harsh, cheap leftovers, best taken with a side of humility. Still, wine was more than a drink. It was the golden link between the sacred and the everyday. It was offered to the gods before meals, present during oaths, sacrifices, weddings, funerals, and awkward romantic confessions. Wine didn't just get you drunk, it made you Greek. The Romans didn't invent wine, but they turned it into a weapon of culture. For them, wine was more than pleasure, it was a statement. Drinking wine meant you were civilized. Not drinking it marked you as a barbarian. Drinking too much? You were probably a senator. Roman vineyards stretched across the empire, from Italy's hills to Gaul's rocky soil. Wine was so vital, that the soldiers got daily rations of it alongside bread and olive oil, not just as a perk, but as part of a deliberate strategy. Mead flowed freely, often served by a high-status woman called the Migjiva, who wasn't just handing out drinks, she was handing out honor and social rank. A single sip could boost your standing or leave you with a black eye and no pants. Druids, the bearded mystics, were said to use mead in rituals, believing it sparked divine inspiration, especially after the third cup. It was linked to fertility, prophecy, and maybe the occasional hallucination that your cow spoke Latin. Burial practices showed how sacred this buzz was. Archaeologists have found cauldrons and cups in elite graves, some still containing fermented honey or grain. Apparently, even in the afterlife, a Celt wouldn't go dry. But mead wasn't the only drink. Beer was also popular, often flavored with herbs like heather, bog myrtle, or yarrow, adding taste, mild psychoactive effects, and the chance of a woodland vision. Wine was imported but reserved for chiefs and kings, showing off to Roman guests. If the Celts turned mead into a wild ritual, the Norse saw it as a cosmic pact. For Vikings, alcohol wasn't just for feasting, it played a role in the afterlife, divine battles, and even poetic inspiration through godly spit. Take the mead of poetry, a mythical brew made from the blood and saliva of a slain wise man. Norse myths say the gods accidentally created it and instantly recognized its power. Anyone who drank it gained the ability to write epic poetry, or at least drunk rhymes with flair. The Norse believed that heroic death sent you to Valhalla, not a peaceful heaven, but Odin's grand hall. There, Valkyries served endless mead, warriors fought daily, died gloriously, resurrected, and did it all again like a never-ending, violent Oktoberfest. This heavenly mead came from the teats of a magical goat named Hydrun, who stood on Valhalla's roof and somehow produced a daily flow of honeyed drink. No one knew what the goat ate or how it worked, but the buzz was too good to question. On Earth, Norse mead halls were the heart of politics and community. Chiefs held massive feasts to show power, build alliances, and keep warriors loyal. Drinking was a spectacle. Toasts honored gods, ancestors, and fallen heroes. Poets, or skalds, performed sagas powered by courage in a cup and probably a few embellished tales. Drinking horns were treasured items, often adorned with silver, runes, and dragons. And like much in Norse culture, there were strict customs. If someone handed you a horn, you drank. Turning it down could lead to a fight, or at least an uncomfortable silence broken by someone hurling an axe. Unlike the more refined Roman wine or Egyptian beer, Norse alcohol was bold, symbolic, and often potent enough to blur the line between man and legend. Mead was a staple, consumed before battles, after triumphs, during weddings and at funerals, sometimes all in the same week. While the West was busy with beer and romantic odes, ancient China was mastering the art and science of alcohol. Drinking wasn't just recreation, it was ritual, religion, and sometimes a political gamble. Jew was the catch-all term for alcohol, covering everything from light rice beers to strong-grained spirits. The earliest Chinese alcohol, brewed from rice, honey, and fruit, dates back to 7000 BCE, meaning that while the Sumerians were figuring out irrigation, the Chinese were already crafting cocktails. But in ancient China, drinking wasn't about indulgence. It was about harmony, timing, and restraint. Confucian teachings emphasized moderation. Getting drunk at a banquet wasn't just a personal slip. It was a disruption of cosmic balance. Rituals were central. Alcohol was offered to ancestors, nature, and at formal ceremonies. Emperors held grand banquets where officials were expected to drink, but not overdo it. One bad toast and you might lose your job or worse. And then came the drinking games. Banquets weren't just about formality, they featured dice, riddles, and spinning arrows to pick the next drinker. The loser drank, so did the winner. The real goal was to keep your dignity intact. Poets and scholars turned alcohol into inspiration. Li Bai, the famed Tang dynasty poet, wrote some of his best work while drunk, even trying to hug the moon's reflection in a river. He once said all he needed was a pot of wine among the flowers to feel the universe unfold. Let's be honest, most of us have had a poetic moment after a few shots of baijiu. Alcohol itself has changed over time, evolving from cloudy rice wines to clear, strong spirits like hangju and baijiu, the kind of drink that could either disinfect a wound or cause one if passed around too freely. While many ancient cultures drank to celebrate, the early Indians might have been sipping in search of spiritual truth, or at least trying to. Enter Soma, one of the most mysterious and legendary drinks in human history. Was it wine, a mushroom, a fermented plant? No one really knows. What is known is that it was sacred and powerful, mentioned over 100 times in the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedic scriptures. Soma wasn't just a drink, it was a deity, a divine force you could actually consume. The hymns describe Soma as flowing like gold, charging like a horse, and making the drinker feel immortal. You know, the usual effects of ancient chemistry. It was consumed by priests during rituals and sacrifices believed to bring clarity, divine insight, and likely some vivid hallucinations. The drink was made by pressing juice from a mysterious plant, mixing it with milk or water, filtering it through wool, offering it to the gods, and then finally drinking it. A truly divine process. Priests claimed that after drinking Soma they could speak with Indra, the storm god, and even witness the heavens part. Whether that was divine contact or an early form of psychedelic use is still debated. But it wasn't for everyone. Only Brahmins and ritual specialists were allowed to partake. Think of it as an exclusive spiritual happy hour with cosmic stakes. Drinking Soma wasn't for fun, it was for transcendence. Eventually, the original Soma plant vanished, whether due to time, climate shifts, or someone munching the last batch during a vision trip. Later scriptures like the Atharva Veda refer to Soma more symbolically, calling it the drink of life or nectar of the gods. Some scholars believe it evolved into Amrita, the mythical drink of immortality, a more spiritual version of the divine brew. Even today, the mystery of Soma captivates historians, botanists, and spiritual seekers. Was it a psychedelic mushroom, a fermented milkweed, something now extinct? Whatever it was, its impact was deep enough to shape a whole religious worldview. In ancient societies, alcohol was sacred, healing, social, and sometimes totally destructive. For every priest chanting over a holy drink, there was a ruler somewhere drinking himself into disaster. Because while fermentation could build civilizations, it also had a knack for toppling them. Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world, but he was also known for his heavy drinking. He once drank a huge bowl of undiluted wine in a contest and never recovered. Some believe a mix of wine, exhaustion, and possibly poison led to his death at 32. Others think the real mistake was trying to outdrink his own soldiers. In China's Shang dynasty, King Duxin was known for his lake of wine and forest of meat, an actual lake filled with alcohol and trees hung with roasted animals. He hosted parties where guests drank until they fell into the lake. Unsurprisingly, the dynasty soon collapsed. Roman emperors were no better. Caligula's madness was fueled by wine. Nero drank heavily during his dramatic dinners and often cried for himself. Commodus, who thought he was Hercules reborn, would drink and fight in the arena. Their rule often turned into chaos, cruelty, and public breakdowns, all worsened by excessive drinking. Even Norse legends warned of kings who drank too much. A drunk ruler couldn't hear the gods, lead his warriors, or stay upright at feasts, an embarrassment in a culture where honor was everything. Ancient texts across civilizations advised against overdrinking. Confucius spoke of moderation, Vedic hymns warned of losing spiritual focus, and even the wine-loving Greeks frowned on public drunkenness. Alcohol wasn't the core issue, it was the loss of control. When rulers were ruled by drink, everything else began to crumble. In ancient Egypt, dogs were more than pets. They were sacred, symbols of status, and even seen as divine messengers. These dogs weren't playing fetch, they lived in luxury, joined royal hunts, and were buried with more honor than most people. Pharaohs and elites adored them. Greyhounds were especially valued for their elegance and hunting skills. These were no street mutts. They had names like Reliable, Brave One, and North Wind carved into tomb walls. Some were given ranks adorned with jewelry and attended by personal servants. In a sense, they were both pets and minor celebrities within the royal court. Dogs also held deep religious significance. The jackal, Egypt's most dog-like animal, was linked to Anubis, the god of embalming, and the underworld. But Anubis wasn't just some eerie figure haunting pyramids. He was a guardian, guiding souls through the afterlife. Many believed dogs, by extension, shared this protective role. That's why they weren't just buried with their owners, they were sometimes mummified themselves, complete with tiny coffins, inscriptions, and painted masks. And it wasn't only the elite who owned dogs. Archaeological findings from workers' villages and rural homes show that everyday Egyptians kept them too. Some houses had kennels, and others featured murals of playful dogs lounging beneath dining tables, proof that even 3,000 years ago people were sneaking food to dogs under the table. One of the most touching signs of Egypt's affection for dogs comes from the tomb of a nobleman named Inf. Inscriptions there mourn his loyal dog, Behike, praising the animal's loyalty, hunting ability, and gentle spirit, like a heartfelt eulogy for a lost friend. You can almost picture Inf holding a wine jar, tearfully remembering his old hunting companion. By the New Kingdom period, dogs had secured a place not just in Egyptian households, but in their hearts. They weren't just hunting aids or status symbols, they were family. And while dogs had rank in ancient Egypt, cats had divinity. These feline companions weren't just beloved, they were worshipped. In a culture that valued order, balance, and protection, the cat represented all three. Sleek, composed, deadly to pests, and intriguingly independent. It's no surprise that the Egyptians saw them as magical. At the center of this feline reverence stood the goddess Bastet. Once a fierce lioness figure, Bastet evolved into the graceful domestic cat goddess associated with home, fertility, music, and guardianship. Her temples, especially the magnificent one in Bubastis, were filled with worshippers bearing food, gifts, and countless mummified cats, thousands upon thousands, carefully wrapped and buried like kings and queens. Picture a sacred pet cemetery as big as a small town. But cats weren't only honored in temples, they were an integral part of everyday life. They were seen as entertaining, though sometimes unruly, members of the household. Some were dressed in tiny outfits, others trained to imitate the servants. These were the original mischievous pets, adorable, smart, and just as likely to launch something gross across the atrium. Romans also loved keeping unusual animals like dormice, which were both pets and snacks. Tortoises, snakes, and even peacocks were owned by those wanting to show off a bit of exotic style. A senator with a peacock wasn't just rich, he was saying, "Look how little I care about practicality." Pets weren't just for comfort, they were displays of power, taste, and global reach. In a world shaped by conquest, having a parrot that could quote Virgil or a Persian dog wasn't just charming, it was a status symbol. In imperial China, pets were more than playthings. They represented harmony, discipline, and beauty. While Western elites showed off their lapdogs and parrots, Chinese emperors were creating living works of art. Goldfish gliding in porcelain bowls, crickets singing in delicately carved cages, and dogs that symbolized loyalty, fortune, or even cosmic balance. Take goldfish, not the snack, but the spectacle. Bred from carp during the Tang dynasty, they were treasured not just for looks, but for their elegance and calming presence. By the Song dynasty, emperors and scholars were selectively breeding them, showcasing rare varieties in decorative ponds and ceramic basins. Watching them was like a peaceful meditation, like scrolling through Instagram if Instagram had gills and flawless fins. Then there were crickets. Yes, crickets. Kept in tiny cages made of bamboo or ivory, these insects were more than pets. They were musical companions. Their chirping was seen as soothing, poetic, even spiritual. Song dynasty poets wrote about the soft sorrow of cricket songs, and by the Qing era, kids raised them like athletes for chirping contests. Some crickets were pampered better than the servants. Small lapdogs were also adored, especially among the nobility. Breeds like the Peking Shih and Shih Tzu weren't just cute, they were imperial icons. Bred to resemble mythical Chinese lions, they were considered sacred, even semi-divine. According to legend, the Peking Shih came from lions who shrank themselves out of love for Buddhist monks. Whether that's true or not, it's one of the rare tales where the ending is delightfully fuzzy. Cats were more than pest controllers in ancient times. They were beloved companions. Art from the period shows women cradling cats like children, petting them at meals, and letting them relax under banquet tables. Some cats even wore ornate collars and gold earrings, strutting through noble homes like furry fashion icons. The bond between humans and cats was so strong that even accidentally harming one could bring harsh penalties, including death. Killing a cat, even unintentionally, was legally a capital crime. In one instance, during the Ptolemaic period, a Roman soldier who killed a cat was lynched by a mob, and even the pharaoh didn't intervene. In death, cats were honored like royalty, mummified with care, their faces painted and placed in carved sarcophagi. Some were buried alongside their owners. One tomb inscription lovingly refers to a cat as "my beloved who walks with me in the field of reeds," a poetic allusion to the afterlife. The Romans, known for refining cultural practices, turned pet ownership into an art. If an animal could be carried, cuddled, or trained to mimic Latin insults, it likely found a home in a Roman villa. Dogs, birds, monkeys, anything small enough for a lap or shoulder became a fashionable companion. Wealthy Roman women especially favored lapdogs, often of Eastern origin, similar to today's Maltese or Pekingese. These dogs were spoiled with treats, wore gold collars, and even had tiny couches. One such dog, praised in its epitaph as gentler than a dove and a quiet, loyal friend, was deeply mourned. Exotic birds like parrots and starlings were also popular among the elite, trained to speak in Latin or Greek and kept in lavish cages. One parrot famously greeted banquet guests until it died from overexcitement, prompting its owner to host a full funeral with flowers and speeches. Spectacle mattered to Romans, even for birds. Monkeys brought in from Africa and India were also prized as exotic pets. It was freedom through marriage proposals and forgetting the past by putting on an apron. And while it worked for a few, many of these women were still pirates at heart, just better disguised. If you think today's media loves scandal, the 18th century was even worse. Whenever a woman was caught, tried, or even rumored to be a pirate, the pamphlets came faster than cannon fire. Newspapers, broadsheets, and gossip papers went wild. They told stories of sea she-devils, corset-wearing killers, and weapon-wielding temptresses. Some of it was true, most of it wasn't. But truth wasn't the point. Sales were. Female pirates became instant tabloid stars. Their trials became public theatre, with crowds gathering not for justice, but to see a woman who drank rum, carried guns, and talked back to authority, all at once, if possible. Some articles painted them as tragic victims, misled by bad men and rum. Others portrayed them as savage beasts who stabbed for sport, or worse, wore sailors' clothes. Scandalous. This obsession created a tricky situation for the courts. If they executed her, she could become a martyr. If they spared her, they looked weak. Either way, it was a lose-lose, especially when the public devoured every twist for a penny a copy. Authorities hated the attention. They didn't want their trials turning into theatre. Female pirates didn't fit neatly into legal boxes. Worse, they spoke out, some with clever answers, some mocking the judges, and others making sharp political jabs that probably made courtroom scribes choke on their ink. And the public loved it. Sometimes this unexpected fame helped. A female pirate with enough public support or curiosity might get a lighter sentence, just so the authorities could avoid backlash. Killing her might cause outrage, or worse, inspire imitators. But not everyone was lucky. Fame could vanish quickly. One bad headline and you went from rebel to villain. While today's long-haired cat breeds are modern versions, their ancestors likely came from the cold, mountainous areas of ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, where their thick fur kept them warm. These cats were admired for their beauty, calm nature, and their regal lounging style, something emperors could relate to. Although early Persian texts don't name them directly, artwork and artifacts show that cats lived in elite homes, symbolizing elegance and status. But Persians didn't stop at cats. They created full-scale private zoos. Achaemenid kings like Darius and Xerxes kept collections of exotic animals from across their vast empire. Lions, leopards, bears, and rare birds weren't just for show. They were displays of imperial power, welcoming foreign envoys beside a tiger cage. That's diplomacy with teeth. Diplomacy with animals used for hunting were especially important to the Persian upper class. Falcons, hawks, and cheetahs were trained for a noble sport called basnama. Falconry wasn't just a pastime, it symbolized control, discipline, and harmony with nature. Teaching a bird to return to the glove showed patience and prestige. Sassanid-era miniature paintings often depict noblemen with falcons perched gracefully on their arms, whether ready to hunt or striking a pose for royal image building. Hunting dogs also had their place, particularly hounds, used to chase gazelles and wild cattle across tough terrain. Like in Egypt or Rome, these dogs had names, were loved, and sometimes even given proper burials. Ancient Persian pet culture was both affectionate and strategic. These animals were companions but also status symbols. A falcon or lion wasn't just for pleasure, it was a living emblem of power. Meanwhile, the Indus Valley Civilization, 2600 to 1900 BCE, still shrouded in mystery due to its undeciphered script and unknown rulers, also had a fondness for animals. Unlike the extravagant pet customs of Rome or Egypt, life in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro was more modest and heartwarming. Archaeologists have found dog figurines, playful, floppy-eared, tail-wagging ones, not fierce or aggressive, but clearly cherished pets. Dog remains near homes suggest they lived closely with people, guarding property, herding animals, and offering companionship. The discovery of dog-shaped toys, carts, and animal whistles among children's belongings shows these animals were part of everyday family life, not just tools for work. Cats, too, lived among them. While not as prominent as in Egypt, feline remains have been found in residential areas, suggesting cats were kept for their skill in hunting rodents, an important role in a society dependent on granaries, but also valued for their calm companionship. You can picture a Harappan woman weaving cloth while a cat naps in a patch of sunlight. However, the most iconic animal of the Indus Valley was the humped bull, seen on numerous seals. These animals were probably sacred or symbolic rather than domestic pets, but the organized and peaceful nature of Indus cities implies animals were treated with care. Elephants too appear in seals and figurines, and may have been semi-domesticated here earlier than anywhere else. Unlike other ancient civilizations, the Indus people didn't display exotic animals or hold elaborate pet funerals. They seemed to value practicality, familiarity, and balance. Animals didn't need golden collars or ornate tombs, just a place in the home and a task to fulfill. In the ancient world, losing a beloved pet was never taken lightly. Whether you were a pharaoh, Roman matron, or Mesopotamian farmer, the death of an animal companion was often marked by rituals, remembrance, and sometimes tombs more elaborate than those of ordinary people. Egypt led the way in animal burials. Cats, dogs, monkeys, ibises, even crocodiles were mummified, wrapped in linen, lovingly decorated, and placed in necropolises for animals. One such site near Saqqara contained over 4 million mummified ibises, honoring the god Thoth and showcasing Egypt's intense dedication. Some pets were laid to rest with their owners or in individual sarcophagi inscribed with phrases like "beloved of the house" or "faithful companion in life and death," essentially ancient pet headstones in hieroglyphs. The Greeks and Romans expressed their grief in more personal ways. Stone epitaphs honored small dogs and birds with emotional tributes. One Roman inscription reads, "I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place, as much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my arms." Another mourns a dog named Margarita. She never barked without cause, but now she is silent. These weren't casual remarks, they reflected deep emotional ties. Even in a world where death came quickly, pets were grieved like family. Some had offerings, funerals, even statues made in their memory. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets sometimes referenced animal companions, often in relation to omens or household well-being. Although fewer pet burials have been found, Some dogs were given names and occasionally buried in hand-dug graves with items like food or collars, suggesting belief in their journey to the afterlife. Even in pragmatic cultures like the Indus Valley and ancient China, simple animal graves have been found, sometimes with small offerings or near-human tombs, as if to say, "This companion goes with you." Across the ancient world, one thing was clear: pets were not just possessions. They were companions. Whether laid to rest in riches or simple clay, they were cherished, honored, and loved. Because in every era, goodbye wasn't just farewell, it was a promise to reunite beyond this world. In ancient Babylon, superstition wasn't a side belief, it was a state doctrine. Everything from royal policies to daily farming depended on celestial signs and whispered omens. Babylonian priests didn't study the stars for amusement. They treated them like divine messages from moody gods, constantly trying to interpret the next looming crisis. To the Babylonians, the cosmos was a precise mechanism governed by deities, and any unusual occurrence in the sky, a strange cloud, a red moon, or a comet, signaled a cosmic disturbance. These weren't just curiosities, they were signs, curses, or divine gestures. To understand them, they created an elaborate system of divination. One of the main methods was reading celestial omens recorded in massive texts like the Enuma Anu Enlil, which listed thousands of sky-based signs. It didn't just predict an eclipse, it said things like, if the moon darkens on the 14th day and Mars is red in the east, the king of Akkad will die. Highly detailed and highly stressful. Specially trained astrologer priests known as Baru interpreted these signs. They spent years learning to read the sky, animal livers, oil patterns, and even the way incense smoke curled. If Jupiter seemed a bit too confident one night, you might have to fast, sacrifice animals, or cancel a royal event, especially if you were the king. Monarchs were so afraid of bad omens that they sometimes appointed a substitute king, a kind of royal decoy, to sit on the throne during dangerous times. And when the threat passed, let's just say the substitute didn't retire peacefully. Ordinary Babylonians weren't left out either. People wore charms, avoided certain days for travel or childbirth, and checked omen tablets before big decisions. If your door creaked oddly or a black dog crossed your path, you didn't just brush it off, you worried it might be a curse. In ancient Egypt, superstition wasn't hidden. It was displayed on your jewelry, painted on your tomb, and carved in bold hieroglyphs, strong enough to catch a god's eye. Life was uncertain, the afterlife even more so, and between the two lay a maze of spiritual dangers. The answer? Some female pirates didn't have to pretend to be pregnant, get married, or act domestic to avoid execution. All they had to do was talk, loudly, and about everyone. Snitching wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Authorities craved intel. They weren't just after pirates. They wanted to break up networks, uncover smuggling routes, and seize ships. So when a captured woman offered to reveal names, locations, and where a certain captain hid his treasure, people listened. And these women often had real information. They'd sailed with ruthless crews, overheard secrets over drinks, and knew which ports looked the other way on certain days. Facing the noose made their memories impressively clear and valuable. In return, they might get pardons, shorter sentences, or at least a delay, and a slightly better cell. This wasn't always cowardice. Pirate crews, especially in the Caribbean, hated informants. But with the hangman testing the rope, loyalty became flexible. Some women just wanted time, others walked free. A few even turned snitching into a job, helping naval forces track down old shipmates. Imagine the drama when a woman who once led a mutiny now calmly points out her ex-crew's hideout in court. Ruthless? Maybe. Effective? Definitely. But not all of it was true. Some made things up, naming dead people, inventing smuggling rings, or claiming they once rode with Blackbeard's ghost. The authorities rarely verified and often took it all in. It didn't always work. Some women were still hanged after telling everything. But others walked away, maybe chuckling as they settled in a quiet coastal town where no one knew they'd once threatened a Spanish captain with a red-hot poker. Becoming an informant was the ultimate pirate's switch. Less swashbuckling, more strategy. Not every female pirate escaped the gallows. For every Anne Bonny who used pregnancy or Ching Shih who negotiated with empires, others met their end. And when they did, it wasn't silent. Amulets, tons of them. These weren't just decorative items. Egyptian amulets were seen as magical tools, small sacred objects believed to channel divine power and protect the wearer from illness, accidents, evil spirits, and especially bad vibes from others. Each shape served a purpose. The ankh symbolized life. The jed offered stability and resilience. The scarab beetle represented rebirth, renewal, and a protective, wide-eyed gaze. Think of it as ancient insurance, only with style. Children wore fish-shaped charms to guard against drowning. Pregnant women carried images of the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet or the frog deity Heket to protect their pregnancies. Even cats, treated like divine household members, wore collars adorned with protective symbols. No creature was too furry to avoid a curse. But nowhere was the belief in amulets stronger than in the tombs. The afterlife was full of danger, snakes, demons that beheaded people, crocodile-headed creatures that consumed souls. It was a cosmic horror maze. To guard against it, the dead were buried with amulets sewn into their linen wrappings, placed over organs, and embedded in coffins. The most iconic was the Eye of Horus, or Wedjat, believed to heal and protect both body and spirit. In essence, mummies were wrapped in spiritual bubble wrap, and wherever protection exists, there's always a perceived threat. Egyptians feared curses, spoken or written, considered a kind of magical defamation. Tomb curses were very real, often inscribed with bold threats. May the crocodile devour him. May the hippopotamus attack him. May the scorpion sting him. If you disturbed a tomb, you were warned. No subtlety. These curses were intended to frighten grave robbers and ensure the soul, or K, remained undisturbed. And considering how many 19th century archaeologists died under strange circumstances after opening tombs, maybe they were on to something. Superstition in Egypt wasn't about passivity. It was a deliberate, protective strategy. You didn't just wait for misfortune. You armed yourself with turquoise charms, sacred beetles, and divinely blessed falcons, ready to face the unknown with as much mythical support as possible. These were not mere jokes, but protective symbols. The Romans believed the phallus possessed the power to repel the malocchio, or evil eye, and to bring good fortune, fertility, and overall prosperity. These symbols were carved on walls, worn as jewelry, and even hung from children's necklaces. Subtlety was not their forte. Superstition was deeply ingrained in daily life. A sneeze would prompt someone to immediately exclaim, "Salve!" not out of courtesy, but to prevent a soul from escaping the body. Making a vow while stepping on your own shadow was seen as ill-fated. Dropping a toga pin on the left side, a sign to be cautious. Augury, the practice of, "Hey everyone, Tonight we're diving into the complicated lives of some of the most inbred women in medieval history, born to cousins, married to uncles, sometimes both. These women were trapped in the royal habit of keeping both power and bloodlines in the family. Before we get started, go ahead and like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content. And drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing the global crowd. Now turn down the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some background white noise, and let's ease into tonight's story. Hannah of Castile was born in 1479, the third child of two very powerful and very closely related rulers, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. They're the same duo who funded Columbus, expelled the Moors, and thought cousin marriage was still a brilliant political strategy. Hannah was part of the Trastamara dynasty, which had a long-standing habit of intermarriage. By the time she was born, the royal bloodline was technically functional, but brought with it emotional instability, deep sadness, and the occasional unfortunate jawline. As a teenager, Hannah was sent to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, who, despite the nickname, was more of a carefully engineered Habsburg than a looker. Naturally, he was her cousin. The Habsburgs were obsessed with two things: collecting thrones and ignoring genetic red flags. At first, things seemed to go well. Hannah was smart, beautiful, and reportedly smitten with Philip. Unfortunately, he didn't return the sentiment and preferred the company of other women. Her passionate and jealous reactions didn't sit well in a court where loveless marriages and casual infidelity were the norm. When Philip died suddenly, supposedly from typhoid, possibly from karma, Hannah did not take it well. She refused to be separated from his body, having his coffin brought along as she travelled through Spain, even opening it from time to time to look at him. Romantic? Maybe. Disturbed? Also maybe. Her many political rivals used this as ammunition. Her father Ferdinand claimed it proved she was mentally unfit to rule, and her son Charles, who would become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, did the same. Conveniently, both ended up ruling in her place while she spent most of her life confined to a convent. Was Hannah truly insane? Historians still argue about it. Some believe she suffered from mental illness made worse by grief and isolation. Others think she was simply a political problem in a world where being a passionate woman who called out her husband's infidelity was practically a crime. Draga were undead warriors driven by vengeance, jealousy, and a stench of decay. A particularly greedy or cruel person in life might rise from their burial mound to torment the living. To prevent this, people turned to serious superstitions, placing weapons incorrectly in the grave, casting binding spells, or even driving a stake through the corpse's chest. Long before Dracula, the Vikings were not taking any risks. Additionally, there were trolls, elves, and landvetir, spirits tied to the land. Angering them by building in the wrong place could result in your farm burning down or your cows mysteriously dying. While not as prominent as in Egypt, evidence of cat remains has been found in residential areas, suggesting they were kept for their rodent hunting abilities, crucial in a grain-based society, but also valued for their calm companionship. One can picture a Harappan woman weaving as a cat naps in a patch of sunlight. Still, the most recognizable animal of the Indus Valley was the humped bull, seen on numerous seals. These animals were likely symbolic or sacred rather than domestic companions. but the well-planned and peaceful cities of the Indus suggest animals were generally treated with respect. Elephants, possibly semi-domesticated here earlier than anywhere else, also appear in seals and figurines. Unlike other ancient civilizations, the Indus people didn't display exotic animals or hold elaborate pet funerals. They seemed to prioritize practicality, familiarity, and balance. Animals didn't need golden collars or mummification, just a role and a place in the household. In the ancient world, losing a beloved pet was a serious matter. Whether you were a pharaoh, a Roman matron, or a Mesopotamian farmer, the death of an animal companion often led to rituals, memorials, and even tombs more elaborate than those of ordinary people. Egypt was the undisputed leader in animal burials. Cats, dogs, monkeys, ibises, even crocodiles were carefully mummified, wrapped in linen, painted with detail, and buried in dedicated necropolises. One site near Saqqara held over 4 million mummified ibises, a tribute to the god Thoth and a testament to Egypt's thoroughness. Some pets were buried with their owners or in their own sarcophagi inscribed with phrases like "beloved of the house" or "faithful companion in life and death," essentially ancient pet tombstones in hieroglyphs. The Greeks and Romans approached this more personally and emotionally. Epitaphs carved in stone honored small dogs and birds with poetic touches. One Roman inscription reads, "I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place, as much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my arms." Another mourns a dog named Margarita. She never barked without cause, but now she is silent. These weren't casual expressions, they reflected profound emotional bonds. Even in times when death was a constant presence, pets were mourned as family, sometimes given offerings or their own funerals. Some even had statues made in their honor. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets occasionally reference animal companions, often linked to omens or household well-being. Though few animal graves have been found, records suggest dogs were named and, in rare cases, buried in carefully prepared graves with items like food or collars, as if preparing them for the afterlife. Even in pragmatic Indus Valley and ancient China, traces of animal burials hint at a quiet reverence. Simple graves with offerings, sometimes near human tombs, as if to say, "You'll need this friend in the next life." Across the ancient world, one belief remained constant: pets were not mere property.